In this lecture, I want to talk about exploratory research, the various types of exploratory research, and qualitative data. All right, let's look at exploratory research in more detail. Recall that exploratory research is done when one does not understand the problem. When the researcher doesn't know what needs to be measured, what needs to be investigated. It's research that puts flesh on the bones that are sort of implied by the management problem. So it's very much an early on investigation. It's almost always sort of unstructured. Typically, it's qualitative data. Qualitative data in marketing typically is either observations of people's behaviors or verbal text reports, as opposed to quantitative data, which can be reflected with numbers, in particular with intervally scaled numbers. Now, the reason that we rely on qualitative data is a couple of reasons. In exploratory research situations, we don't know what to measure, so we have to ask people to talk about things without giving them very specific categories of response. And so we simply record what they say. Or we watch what they're doing, and we don't know exactly what they're going to do, and so we watch everything that they're doing. And that, of course, limits our ability to interpret what's going on, but one hopes it leads to more specific and more structured and more quantitative questions down the road. The responses are rich, but not structured. Rich, when we're talking about data, means that you're getting a lot of responses that reflect the same underlying constructs. So, for example, I might measure brand attitude with a single quantitative question that says, rate your attitude toward Pepsi-Cola on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is very negative and 7 is extremely positive. Extremely negative to extremely positive. So that's one single quantitative measure. On the other hand, I might ask you to talk about Pepsi-Cola. And we might talk about Pepsi-Cola for 15 minutes. And you would talk about all the times you've drunk Pepsi-Cola. You might sort of characterize what you think the flavor is like. You might compare it with other brands. You might talk about friends and family members, differences in cola preferences. You might give me your history of relationship with Pepsi-Cola, when you drank it, when you didn't drink it. You might talk about other Pepsi brands, Diet Pepsi, cherry flavored Pepsi, etc., and what you think of those. And so I get a lot of these things that reflect at least partly your attitude toward Pepsi. And so on the one hand, you're getting a rich set of data, but on the other hand, it's not structured, it's not limited, it's not very well focused on particular variables. And exploratory research tends to be inductive because we don't have a very clear theory to guide us. So remember that deductive research starts with a theory that that we can test with specific falsification research, whether it's experiments or surveys. But in an exploratory situation, we don't know what to measure, so we don't have an idea of what's going on. So we tend to make some observations and then we abstract from those some sense of understanding. So case studies are on a type of exploratory research. Case study is a close examination of a sample of one. So they're sometimes called N=1 research. And most students are familiar with case studies. In the context of a business education, a case study usually is a detailed report of one company. So you might look at REI, it might be a history of the company, or it might be, for example, REI's response in a more specific situation, the introduction of its online store. You might look at, there's a case, for example, of Black & Decker's response to a product failure and their decision to recall some toaster ovens that caught fire. But it's one company and one company's situation. Now the data are deep and rich. Deep in the sense that you're getting data from multiple sources. So you may get, the case may have data on sales, it may have data on marketing expenditures, it might have reports from individuals, there may be HR information, there may be operations information. So it's both wide and deep. So that's what I mean by deep and rich. You're getting data from a number of sources and you're getting lots of different perspectives on the same issue. A lot of case studies are done to provide benchmarks. So you might look at the average, but more typically the best practices. So you might pick a case of a very successful company and say, okay, what did this company do? And can we, with the hope of getting some insight about how to be successful. Wide-ranging, again, getting back to the deep, rich idea, you tend to get information across functions and across roles. In companies, often descriptive research tends to be limited to a given function, whether it's marketing or maybe even advertising or sales. In a case study, you typically get information across all the functions. And even it also applies to consumers. In a case of a single consumer, now you don't see so many cases on the consumer side, but you would probably get that consumer's perspective plus other members of the consumer's household, or maybe friends of that consumer and their perspectives. And so again, it gives you this sort of richer network of information about the single case. Now, on the plus side is this richness, but case studies are very limited. One limit is access and time. If you were to, let's say you were going to enter the camping equipment industry, a market, and you wanted to do a case on REI, getting access to the people at REI would take a lot of time and a lot of resources. And so often firms rely on secondary research, so they will look at case studies that have already been done. Now, again, the same question applies of relevance. Is that secondary research relevant to the current situation? The other major limit is the lack of control. No matter how fully you examine a given case, you don't know the reasons for, it's difficult to conclude the reasons for the firm's, if it's a firm, performance. So you don't, simply because you don't have information on other controlling factors. So if you look at Nike, you get a lot of information that tells you what Nike did, and there's a tendency to say, well, they were successful because they did such and such and such. But we don't know, because there's as much information as you have in a case, there's infinitely more information that you do not have about their competitors, about the environment, about um, whatever factors, their suppliers, their retailers, their employees, um, and we just don't know those things. A second type of exploratory research is personal interviews. We want to know what's going on, what's the nature of the problem. Let's talk to some people. Uh, this is done one-on-one in real time, usually face-to-face, although can be done over the phone or the internet. The obvious value of doing it face-to-face is that you get to read nonverbal reactions and follow up on them. Personal interviews are semi-structured in the sense that you have a few questions that you want to make sure that you ask, and you may have some questions that sort of direct people along the way, but you're always following up. So if people raise issues that you hadn't thought about, you follow them and you investigate them. And one way of investigating or following up is called laddering. And laddering is simply asking why or what. Um, you say you bought brand X. Why did you buy brand X? Okay, you say that brand X was at a lower price. Well, why was that sufficient for you to buy brand X? Was it that uh, what you want to know is whether the lower price offset some lower performance from brand X, or whether brand X was equally good performance and at a lower price, or maybe even brand X had better performance and was at a lower price. So you're always sort of um, pushing the question further and getting more specific responses till you push it back to some point where they can't provide you with any more information. Obviously, personal interviews provide a very rich source of information. Um, on the other hand, they have serious limits. One is time. Personal interviews take a long time. Often, personal interviews typically, 30 to 45 to 60 minutes each. Um, they may take a lot of time to set up, particularly depending on who you're trying to interview. If you're talking about interviewing purchasing managers for retail outlets or professionals among consumers, it's very difficult to get them. You have to arrange, make appointments, and so on, do lots of callbacks to try to reach those people. Second, they're difficult to code. A lot of this is qualitative data, so it's not merely a matter of checking off numbers. You have to have trained interviewers who can record the entire exchange and then go back and interpret and um, sort of draw conclusions as in process, or hear what's being said and translate that into some code. Not necessarily a number, but often it's a category. Is this a positive response or a negative response? Is this an inquisitive response? Is this a neutral response? Because those interviewers are well trained, they're very expensive. It's not unusual for an interview to run into about $1,000 each. And you lack control. You simply can't get all the information that might be relevant. By talking to one person, you're not finding out much about. If you're talking to a person in a firm, you're not finding out anything else about the firm. If you're talking to a person, an individual consumer, you're not finding out anything about his family or friends. And in the course of a conversation, of course, you're not asking all the questions that might be relevant. You're only sort of following up on what the individual is saying. One of the most common types of exploratory research is focus groups. Focus groups are interviews with 6 to 12 people simultaneously. So it's a group interview. They're popular because you get from 6 to 12 people responding in pretty much the same time that you would have one person responding in a personal interview. They're usually done face-to-face, very rarely done by telephone or internet. Telephone and internet groupings lack a key dimension, which is the group dynamics effect. People don't see each other, they don't feel as much a part of the group. But sometimes you've simply got people at great distances, and it's very, very expensive or impossible to bring them together. They're semi-structured. They're a little more structured than personal interviews because it's harder to follow the unexpected directions of 12 people than it is to follow the unexpected directions of one person. But they are only semi-structured in that the intent here is to uncover what you don't know, is to find out what you don't know about the problem. And so you have to allow the group to establish its own direction. The key difference with focus groups is the group dynamic. It's much like a classroom discussion. You hope that people listen to one another and respond to one another in insightful ways. So you hope that one person in the group will say something and somebody else will respond to that by saying, oh, I disagree with that, or I hadn't thought of that and I actually agree. That's something that I wouldn't have thought of on my own, but I agree it's important, or I agree that I think the same thing. So by having people in a group, you're hoping to get feedback from them, among them, that produces responses that you would not have gotten had you interviewed each of the 6 to 12 people individually. And that sort of process is useful in particular for exploratory research because you're looking for unexpected characteristics of the problem. I mean, if you don't find unexpected characteristics, then why do the research if all you're finding out is what you expected to find in the first place? Focus groups are very fast and convenient. You can normally knock together a focus group within a few days of identifying the management problem. They're relatively inexpensive. $5,000 to $30,000 is about all you would expect to spend on a focus group. And as I say, they can be good sources of insight because you're getting people to respond not only individually, but to be reacting to the group dynamic. On the other hand, there are crucial limits. As I said before, misinterpreting focus group findings is a very common problem in marketing research. The focus group results are not generalizable as descriptions of the marketplace. The very reason that focus groups are good at helping you to understand the problem is the reason why they're not good as a basis for generalization, and that is the artificial situation. You've got people responding in a group. So you're sitting down with a group of 10 people and saying, here's a product, tell me what you think about it. And people are listening to one another and then they're responding. That is not what happens in the marketplace. In the marketplace, when individuals think about a product, they're thinking about it individually, and there are not 9 other people there providing feedback or social pressure to respond that in a given way. If you're showing them an ad or a package or describing characteristics of a product in a focus group, it's a group setting, and people are responding as part of the group. In the marketplace, they are not in a group setting and they're not part of a group. As a result, the level of brand attitude or the level of interest in a product or the concerns about a product that show up may be interesting and suggestive of further research, but they're in no way indications of what will happen in the marketplace. In addition, much less important, but still a concern, is that focus groups are a small sample. And you would never say, gee, I measured 6 people, and therefore I'm ready to generalize about the tens of thousands in my marketplace. Observations are often used in an exploratory sense, but they're not limited to that. Sometimes observations can be done um, to describe marketplaces and even as part of causal research. So let's bear that in mind as I talk about observations. Observations are um, observations are observing. That I don't know how useful that is. Uh, they're observing behaviors. The key here is that the dependent measures are behaviors and not verbal or paper and pencil responses. Um, Observations can be obtrusive or unobtrusive. Obtrusive observations mean that the people being observed know they're being observed. Uh, Unobtrusive observations do not. Now, this distinction has sometimes has important ethical considerations. Do you have the right to violate people's privacy by observing them when they don't know they're being observed? Um, Now, most people would agree that it's okay to observe people in a retail setting because that's public. Uh, Far fewer people would agree that it's okay to observe them on the internet, and very few people would agree that it's okay to unobtrusively observe people using products in their own homes. So researchers need to be sensitive and should always err on the conservative side, I think, in making obtrusive observations. If one is concerned about violating precepts of privacy, um, it's always an option to use an unobtrusive observation, even when to use an obtrusive observation, even when people know they're being observed. In most cases, they tend to act naturally um, after a time. So if you tell people, look, we're going to be watching you, they will act unrealistically for a few minutes, but then after a while they sort of get used to being observed and they tend to act more normally. Not completely, but often an obtrusive observation will suffice. Well, the big question is what to observe. Uh, we know from lots of research that people uh, in eyewitness testimony, for example, will report some things that they were focusing on and are unable to report on many of the other details that they could have been focusing on but weren't, and often are wrong and make false reports or erroneous reports about things that they weren't focusing on. So researchers need to think carefully about what they're going to be looking for before the observation occurs. Now, we get down to technologies, we'll know that the prevailing technology is to record things. So at least researchers have the opportunity to review what was observed and to see it again and again and again if as needed to make additional measures. But even then, the question is always, no matter how many times you watch the thing, what am I looking for? And then how do I code it? If people pick up a product, what does that mean? Does it mean that they're interested in the product? Does it mean they're about to buy the product? If they turn the product around and look at it, does that mean they're more interested than if they didn't turn it around and look at it? It's difficult to interpret behaviors. Observations tend to be limited to natural behaviors. You can't expect people in a grocery store to taste packaged products. They're not going to open them up normally and taste them, so you can't get reactions to taste experiences. Again, so you're sort of limited to what will happen naturally. There are technologies, as I said, almost always, again, there are some ethical concerns over making recordings versus making live observations, but typically observations are recorded. There's a category of observations, most prominently scanner observations that allow you to measure purchase behavior, for example, without recording the actual doing a video recording of people going past the cashier. And then there are a set of technologies that are used in kind of in limited ways that are quite obtrusive. Eye cameras that we can strap onto people when they're looking at packages or advertisements that'll tell us how long and in what direction their eyes are focused with pretty good detail, all the way down to functional MRIs that give us readings of areas of the brain that are activated by certain specific stimuli. The major limits of observation are that we can only observe behaviors and that we have to interpret what we see. So we don't get what's going on in people's minds. And humans are very cerebral. Even the least intelligent of us is a thoughtful, thinking, feeling organism. And if we limit ourselves to what we see only, we get a very thin slice of what's actually going on, I believe. Dummy tables are used in all types of research, exploratory, descriptive, and causal. I bring them up here because they're especially relevant for observational studies. Excuse me. As I mentioned, observational studies require the researcher to think carefully about what's going to be observed. And a dummy table helps you to identify those things. The essence of a dummy table is that it identifies the constructs that are being measured, the way those constructs are being measured, that is the specific measure. So construct might be interest in the product, and the measure might be how long people look at the package, whether or not people hold the package, how much people can tell you about the brand, or how accurately they can identify attributes of the brand. There are a variety of measures there. And the predicted results. So that means that a dummy table essentially reproduces the tables that will go in the report with the expected results. Now, what's the use of a dummy table? One is it's a preview of the interpretation. That is, one could look at the dummy table and say, okay, this is what I would interpret. And bring the skepticism, the appropriate level of skepticism, bringing that appropriate level of skepticism, one would say, did the research include the right constructs? Are these the right measures for those constructs? What types of analysis would be done with these data? Are those the right kinds of analyses? And then, given the predicted results, what would we do with that? How would we apply those results? And that is the key question for the final issue here, which is it provides you a basis for evaluating or at least discussing the costs of the research. Research is not always appropriate, cost appropriate. If research costs $1 million to do and the decision is only can only save the firm $200,000, then of course you wouldn't do the research. Why would you spend $1 million to make the right decision if the value of the right decision is only $200,000, right? So there's a type of statistics called Bayesian analysis, Bayesian, named after a guy named Bayes. I believe Bayes was a 19th century minister, and he developed this form of analysis based on a priori and posterior expectations and values. So essentially, you begin by saying, what would I do if I didn't do the research, and what do I think the outcomes would be, and how likely are those outcomes, and what would be the value of my decision given each of those outcomes? So, in a simple matter, if let's say I'm deciding between two types of ads, which ad would I run if I didn't do the research, and how much difference do I think the ads would make? So I've got a sense of the value of doing the research, the value of knowing the right answer. The next one says, well, if I do the research, what do I think will happen? And for each of the outcomes for the research, how would that change my decision? And in the worst case situation, what I think would happen doesn't matter. I would do the same thing regardless. So no matter what research tells me, I would make the same decision. Well, obviously, then the research has no value to you. In the more realistic situation, sometimes for some research findings, you would change your decision. For other research findings, you would not change your decision. And then the final step is, what's the likelihood of those research outcomes? Because if you knew the likelihood of those research outcomes, then you could put all of them together in a complicated expectancy value model and come up with the value of doing the research. But of course, you don't know the likelihood of the outcomes. And so that's where the managers and the researchers sort of get together and look at this dummy table and say, this is what you think is going to happen. Why do you think it's going to turn out this way? How strongly do you believe it's going to turn out that way? And we can, together, these two groups can at least come to a qualitative assessment of the value of continuing with the research, and at least identify the extreme situations where doing the research is absolutely pointless or doing the research is absolutely critical. We'll talk more about dummy tables as we go on, and I'll provide you with a separate document on dummy tables. They're especially important in doing survey research because they help to assure that you've got all the measures that you need to conduct the analyses that you need to answer the questions that you've identified.